Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us. This today is really an important conversation, and we are grateful to have with us representatives from the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, who has been some of our closest partners in doing this work. That relationship that we have has really allowed us to implement so many important initiatives to benefit from some of the ADL's trainings. And I really want to talk for a couple of minutes about some impactful reports and discussions that the ADL has published over the last month. There's an incredible amount of work that comes from their group. I'm always so impressed with that. And the information and resources shared in that relationship are really vital because they help to keep us abreast of the latest training, the data, and the trends of so many of these extremist groups. This last August, we gathered law enforcement officers to learn about confronting extremism, gathering intelligence, preparing to respond. And Alex Friedfeld, who you'll hear from today, was one of the experts who presented during that training. And one of the most important ways to confront and to protect our communities from the impact of these groups is to constantly be talking about what they're doing. They watch what we're doing. They're gathering intelligence about what we're doing. You know, you may remember we talked earlier in the spring about how so many of these groups have infiltrated even our police departments to get intelligence about how we are going to respond. Well, it's important that we be just as well informed about what they are doing. And one of the purposes of this task force is really to bring together those experts and help us to share that information. And a significant piece of it, and we're going to make it available to you after today's meeting as well, the ADL has recently released its report on murder and extremism in the United States. And that report found that the number of deaths caused by extremist attacks actually dropped in 2022, and that extremist-related murders declined in 2022 as well. But the majority of those events were committed by white supremacists. And the report reminds us of the never-ending work that needs to be done regarding gun control. We cannot become desensitized. And I'm really struck. We talked yesterday in one of our groups about the fact that it's now just the first week of March, and the United States has already passed 100 reported mass shootings. That's what's reported. And that is the earliest in the year we have ever reached that point. That's not a good place to be. That's more than one mass shooting a day. And I was mentioning before that for many of you, if you remember Columbine, which was probably really the first school mass shooting that everyone focused on, the kind of coverage that got. What's really very scary now is they happen so often that they are literally usually relegated to a blurb in page 2 of the Globe on the back of the front page. And it becomes hard to differentiate one incident from another because they happen so frequently. And that desensitization, obviously I can't speak this morning, arises from that numbers. And almost all of the killings that were committed in these bias-based incidents in 2022, in fact, 93% of them were done with firearms. And that has been consistent in extremist violence for years. Many people think of extremists as bringing bombs or explosives. It's really firearms, plentiful, accessible, and in many states in our country, laxly regulated, that are actually the deadly weapon of choice for American extremists. And, you know, yesterday we held a panel talking about violence in schools. And one of the things we talked about was our work around the ever-present ghost guns, the guns that are completely untraceable, that are manufactured in people's homes with their 3D printer, and are exclusively bought and made by people who can't otherwise get a legal gun. And they are not only pervasive, completely confounding in terms of they provide no value to us in terms of an investigation, but they are also, and we had an incident of this just last week, They are guns that, because of the lack of stability that comes from having plastic parts in a steel encased firearm that's going to explode, they are dangerous to the user as well. We had a situation here in Middlesex just 10 days ago where a ghost gun was used to commit a homicide, and it literally blew apart after the shooting. So the explosion that propelled that bullet out literally blew the gun into several pieces that we found at the scene. In 2022, domestic extremists killed at least 25 people in 12 separate incidents. It is a decrease. It's a decrease back to where the numbers were in 2020, but still very scary. I encourage you to read the ADL's comprehensive report and to learn how you can support the legislation that's provided in the chat. The report also includes the ADL's federal policy recommendations. The PROTECT plan is a 7-part plan to decrease the threats posed by domestic extremists and domestic terrorism, while still being conscious, and this is always a balance, of protecting people's civil rights and civil liberties. In addition to putting out that report, the ADL Center on Extremism also hosted a webinar last week called Clear and Present Dangers, Countering Extremism and Hate Facing Our Communities. And we're going to share the meeting recording and resources in the chat. We'll also make it available to people through email. But that webinar discussed white supremacist fight clubs, the surging Christian nationalism, the rising threat of accelerationism, and countering hate through coalitions, featuring the National Urban League. Today, we're going to hear from our local ADL office about new resources to support communities and others in learning more about the use of the law to deter harm and hold individuals and groups responsible for violent extremist actions. Every resource is important. Every one of them can make us stronger, can make our communities stronger, and more able to be nimble in responding to the threats that are being posed. I encourage you to really listen to this information, ask questions, and share the important information with others in your community. I mentioned that we have so many times called upon the ADL to come and help us. I literally think they've blocked my number on their phones. We call them so often to come and be helpful, and they are unfailingly helpful to us in doing that work. And we have with us today Amy Feynman, who serves as the Northeast Area Civil Rights Counsel for the ADL. She oversees ADL's civil rights work in 13 states and advises ADL's five of ADL's regional offices: New England, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. So a really broad swath of the East Coast. Prior to joining the ADL, Amy worked as a litigation associate at the law firm of Latham and Watkins in Boston. She maintained a pro bono practice focused on education, equity, and juvenile justice cases. She is a 2009 graduate of the University of Michigan and a 2012 graduate of UPenn's Law School. Alex Friedfeld, who I mentioned, who's again a repeat appearer here and who just always brings such great information, is an investigative researcher with the ADL Center on Extremism. He monitors anti-government extremism with a particular focus on those militia movements and the Boogaloo movement. He's trained thousands of federal, state, and local law enforcement officers on a variety of extremist and domestic terrorism related incidents. He frequently represents the ADL on national and international media outlets, including CNN, NBC, and The Guardian. And prior to joining the ADL, he worked as an analyst in the New York City Police Department's counterterrorism and intelligence bureaus, where he was monitoring terrorism activity around the world and ran terrorism-related investigations in the city, focused predominantly on ISIS. He has a master's in terrorism and sub-state violence from Georgetown. And again, someone who always, along with Amy, is willing to really think about these issues, craft thoughtful responses, and then so generous in sharing that information. So I am really very happy and very grateful to have both of you with us today. I encourage you, as you're listening, to type any questions you have in the chat or make a note to yourself so you get your questions answered. We'll do as much as we can, both through the chat and taking some live questions at the end. And I know that Amy and Alex are always so available and so generous that if we have questions we don't get to, we'll try to get you answers and get those back to you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy and Alex. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, DA Ryan, and thank you for that incredibly helpful framing of our conversation today. You know, the data that we are tracking is really sobering, and I think indicates to us that a whole of society approach is going to be required to push back on the trends that we are seeing. Today, we are going to highlight just one component of that whole of society approach, and that really is the ways in which we can use litigation, and in particular, civil litigation, to push back against some of the trends that we are seeing. So I want to start with just a quick overview of the Anti-Defamation League. We are an over 100-year-old civil rights and anti-hate organization founded with a mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. Today, we have a number of centers that help us with our work. So we have a center on extremism where Alex sits that tracks and monitors extremist groups and movements. We have a center for technology and society that is really tracking and monitoring hate online. We have a center on anti-Semitism research that is tracking and monitoring trends with respect to anti-Semitic attitudes in the US. And then we also have a legal and government relations division, the legal division furthering our civil rights work and advocacy and our litigation work, and our government relations division really furthering our legislative advocacy work. And then we also have regional offices all across the country that handle incident response each and every day. So I hope you will see ADL as a resource in any of those capacities when it comes to thinking about some of the concerning trends we're facing today when it comes to extremist-fueled threats of violence. So I want to just also frame up front the threat that we are facing. So as folks on this call surely know, we have seen a disturbing rise in extremist violence in recent years. So in 2017, we saw white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, resulting in the death of one counter-protester, injuries to many others. In 2020, members of an extremist group allegedly plotted to kidnap the governor of Michigan, as well as governors of Ohio and Virginia. Of course, on January 6, 2021, we saw groups motivated by conspiracy theories and extremist ideologies storm the Capitol, seeking to prevent the lawful transition of power. And these are really threats to not only individuals, but our democratic institutions and the processes that keep our government in place. So we are seeing targeting and increasing targeting of, government officials, including secretaries of state, law enforcement officers, judges, even medical professionals and local school officials. We really need to be mindful and vigilant of the scope of the threat. ADL has particular expertise in tracking and monitoring anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes. And as you can see here, the data that we are tracking is very concerning. So we've seen in recent years real surges in anti-Semitic incidents all across the country. And the most recent comprehensive hate crime data that we have also shows really disturbing numbers, certainly the highest numbers we've seen in over a decade. So in response, ADL has done a number of things. First and foremost, we have created a new democracy initiatives framework that's really expanded our capacity to provide legal support to communities that find themselves the subject of or the target of extremist violence. So we were able to provide critical advice and support in the Charlottesville litigation, and we're currently serving as co-counsel with the DC Attorney General in civil litigation against the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers arising from the January 6th attack. We are also now expanding our capacity to not only support individuals who are targeted, but also municipalities that find themselves in the crosshairs of extremist-fueled violence. So we're talking about cities and towns, municipalities that may ultimately determine that legal action or legal recourse is an appropriate fit. So how can civil lawsuits combat extremism? So of course, we all know that when hate and extremism leads to violence, individuals can face criminal prosecution, arrest and criminal prosecution, and ADL continues to support district attorneys in connection with that work. But what is sometimes overlooked is the fact that regardless of whether or not a criminal prosecution takes place, civil lawsuits can also disrupt extremist threats. On the civil side, it is possible to recover not only monetary damages, but also injunctive relief, which can deter unlawful conduct moving forward. And there's a lot of room for creativity on the civil side that sometimes gets overlooked. So for example, as part of a civil lawsuit, it may be possible to enter into a settlement agreement pursuant to which a hate crime offender agrees to participate in anti-bias programming or community service. And so there's a lot of room to shape the remedy that will be most effective on the civil side that doesn't always exist on the criminal side. So what types of claims might be available? The scope is actually pretty broad. So in many states across the country, Massachusetts is one of them, there are actually statutory civil causes of action available for hate crime victims. So in addition to our very strong hate crime laws that exist in Massachusetts, individuals who are targeted by hate crimes do have a civil cause of action against the individual who caused harm. In many of these instances, we are also seeing tort claims available. So assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, even defamation claims available. ADL is increasingly focusing on what civil remedies might be available to victims of swatting and doxing, which is a new form of cyber-related harassment, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this presentation. That work is still ongoing. Many states actually are behind the ball in terms of what their statutes look like to protect victims of both of those types of conduct. We also have traditional civil rights litigation that can take place in connection with this type of conduct, and state AGs play a critical role there. And then I also want to talk briefly about litigation under the KKK Act, a Reconstruction era statute that is now being increasingly used in cases like Charlottesville and the DC attack. So whenever we're talking about civil litigation, particularly when it comes to extremist activity, want to be very mindful of First Amendment limitations. So civil litigation is, of course, just as criminal litigation would not be an option, not an option when we're talking about speech or conduct that is protected by the First Amendment. So this could include, for example, protests where demonstrators hold up signs bearing offensive language or distribute hateful flyers, which is something that we are tracking nationwide. This is really cutting edge today. We actually released our white supremacist propaganda distribution report that shows the highest number of white supremacist propaganda distribution incidents since ADL began tracking such data. This took place in 2022. We're also seeing a surge in anti-Semitic messaging in those flyers. So I mentioned before that ADL is increasingly looking to support municipalities as plaintiffs in civil litigation. And so important for town leaders or city leaders to think about what might be recoverable from a municipality perspective. So of course, in cases where extremists or extremist groups damage government property, there may be damages last night. So, but he's damages recoverable there. Certainly, if there are injuries to government personnel, there could be damages recoverable through that lens. And then municipalities can also obtain injunctive relief to prevent future harm, which is something that the city of Charlottesville was able to do in the wake of the Unite the Right rally. So I want to take a brief moment to talk about hate crimes. This is an area in which ADL has particular expertise. In the early 1980s, we crafted one of the first model hate crime laws in the country, and that model has now been adopted in 46 states, as well as the District of Columbia. As I mentioned, hate crime numbers are really surging. You can see that in 2020, we reached numbers that we hadn't seen since back in 2001. On every state's hate crime law is different. There are still many states across the country that do not have hate crime laws at all, or do not have what we call comprehensive and inclusive hate crime laws. Fortunately, Massachusetts does have a comprehensive and inclusive hate crime law. It now requires in Massachusetts an underlying criminal offense with the intent to intimidate a person based on a protected identity characteristic. So really important to both have an underlying criminal offense and be able to show a bias motivation in order for hate crime charges to be appropriate. But Massachusetts hate crime statute is very strong in the sense that bias need not be the exclusive motivating factor for the crime, and that victims do have protections in hate crimes when the perpetrator merely perceives the victim to belong to a certain group or have a certain protected identity characteristic, even if that turns out not to be true. So really important components of Massachusetts' hate crime statute. I do want to flag a really important bill that is pending in Massachusetts now. It's an act to amend the definition of a hate crime that would ensure that associational hate crimes are also covered under Massachusetts law. This is a bill that is sponsored by Senator Cream and DA Ryan, and essentially would ensure that if someone's property is targeted, not because of a belief or perception about the owner of the property, but perhaps someone who is residing within that property, a tenant, for example, that could still give rise to hate crime charges. Or, for example, if someone is targeted not because of their own sexual orientation, but the sexual orientation of their child, that could still give rise to hate crime charges. So really important ways pending in Massachusetts to strengthen and improve our law further. But I also want to briefly mention those civil remedies provisions that I highlighted a moment ago. So in addition to what can be done on the criminal side of things, there are also civil causes of action in Massachusetts that individual victims and the state attorney general's office have to pursue remedies in the wake of hate crimes. So the statute on the left is very broad. It's actually the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act that would provide remedies for individuals who are targeted and whose rights are interfered with through threats, intimidation, or coercion. The Attorney General's office can also step in and file a claim using this statute. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there is a actual cause of action for victims of the very statute that I just highlighted on the previous slide. So victims of hate crimes also have a civil cause of action that they can pursue. So ADL recently launched a pilot program to support hate crime victims using these civil remedies provisions. We started that program in Ohio, but are now expanding nationwide. So want to make sure that folks on this call are aware of that increased capacity to support hate crime victims in thinking through what legal remedies may be available. So transitioning over to cyber hate, I mentioned swatting and doxing as two areas of focus for ADL. I'm going to show a short video pertaining to swatting specifically, and then share a bit more about doxing.
A champion gamer gets the scare of his life. The teen who recently won $3 million in the Fortnite World Cup was at home live streaming when armed officers surrounded his house. Turns out he has become the latest victim of swatting after a phony call was placed to 911.
This teen is the world's best gamer after winning the first ever Fortnite World Cup.
Your world champion!
16-year-old Kyle Giersdorf took home the $3 million prize and became an overnight sensation. But now he is the latest victim of swatting. Kyle was live streaming from his home in Pennsylvania when his dad interrupted him.
Dad, I actually can't.
Then he's told what just happened.
I got swatted.
Kyle abruptly leaves the game.
Did he just leave mid-game?
I think so.
Swatting is a dangerous prank during which someone calls 911 to report a fake crime, prompting SWAT teams to respond to the emergency. That's what happened in the Fortnite case. The swatter called 911 to claim Kyle killed his dad.
Carr said he just shot his father with an AK-47. Said he tied up his mother in the garage and he shot him up and down his body.
It was all a monstrous lie. Kyle returned to his game about 10 minutes later.
Yeah, I got swatted. What if I just got bopped? That's scary.
He's right to be scared. In 2017, this 28-year-old father of two was killed after someone called in a false hostage report, directing cops to his home. He was shot dead at his front door.
Fortunately, the Fortnite champ and his family are all okay.
So as that video shows, swatting is a really serious form of harassment in which someone places a false 911 call reporting a very serious emergency at the location of the target. Oftentimes, the goal is to prompt a really serious law enforcement response. The perpetrator in many cases has the intent of causing physical harm to the target. We're also seeing swatting weaponized against members of marginalized communities. So essentially swatting manifesting as a hate crime where a person is being specifically targeted based on their race, religion, or any other protected identity characteristic. Doxing is a related form of cyber harassment. This essentially involves the posting of someone's private identifying information with specific elements of intent. Ordinarily, perpetrators intend to cause physical harm, death, or stalking of their targets. One example that I'd like to highlight is from 2017. It involves Andrew Anglin, the founder and publisher of a neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer, who posted the name and address of Tanya Gersh, a Jewish real estate agent in Montana, online, as well as photos of her children. And his purpose was really to incite harassment of Tanya Gersh, incited his readers to stalk and terrorize her, and they did just that. So impact of doxing really can't be overstated. So in response to what happened, Tanya said that she received emails, texts, voicemails threatening my life. I was told that I would be driven to the brink of suicide. There were references being thrown into the oven, being gassed, and there were calls with only gunshots in the background. They published suggestions to show up at my house, visit me in person, and get me a loan for a real estate tour. My private and idyllic life became an instant living nightmare. I feared for my life and the lives of my children. So really underscoring the impact that doxing can have. But this is also a success story from a litigation perspective. So Tanya Gersh ultimately, with support of Southern Poverty Law Center, filed a lawsuit and ultimately prevailed. In that case, under state law claims. But as I mentioned before, we're really looking to expand the scope of remedies available to victims of swatting and doxing. On the criminal side in Massachusetts, we do have really strong stalking and harassment statutes that provide protections. But on the civil side, there's still some room for growth. So as part of ADL's National Backspace Hate Campaign, we're looking to encourage states to provide civil remedies for victims of doxing. And in Massachusetts, there are two really important bills to keep an eye on. They are listed here. One sponsored by Senator Feingold and Rep. Wynn, the other sponsored by Senator Roush, which would do just that, provide a civil remedy for victims of doxing in Massachusetts. So I mentioned early on the viability of civil rights litigation. One case to highlight involves a case from 2017 at American University involving Taylor Dumpson, who was inaugurated as the first Black woman student government president at the university. The following day, someone hung bananas on strings fashioned in the shape of nooses all across campus. Once again, Andrew Anglin wrote an article about Dumpson, incited his followers to threaten and harass her. She was threatened and harassed online, feared for her physical safety, was diagnosed with PTSD. And this was a groundbreaking case by Lawyers Committee that ultimately resulted in a favorable ruling. The court found that online harassment can interfere with equal enjoyment of public accommodations, which was a precedent-setting opinion and something to keep an eye on moving forward. This is also an important case to highlight because it really showcases room for creativity on the civil side. So in this case, Lawyers Committee was able to craft a really creative restorative justice settlement with one defendant who expressed genuine remorse and a genuine desire to leave white supremacy behind. So in exchange for not paying monetary damages, the defendant made a formal apology, engaged in counseling, studied racial and social justice, volunteered with organizations advancing racial justice. So it really goes to show the flexibility that exists on the civil side in crafting remedies. Final piece I want to highlight again is the KKK Act. So it's an 1871 law that unfortunately is still relevant today. The key section in this law is section 1985, which makes it a federal crime to conspire by force, intimidation, or threat to prevent someone from voting or holding office or discharging their official duties, or conspiring to deprive any person or class of persons of equal protection of the law. So it does have very broad civil rights protections, and these protections, again, exist at the federal level. There's a corresponding component of the law called Section 1985 that addresses failure to stop Section 1985 conspiracies from taking place. Both of those claims are in play, or claims under both statutes provisions are in play in the January 6th litigation. As I mentioned earlier, ADL is currently serving as co-counsel in one of the cases against Proud Boys and Oath Keepers alongside the DC Attorney General's office, and are hoping to support other attorney generals across the country who are interested in pursuing similar types of claims. But under the KKK Act, in this case in particular, the allegation is that the defendants violently and unlawfully, and in an attempt to prevent, interrupt, hinder, and impede a lawful election, prevented officials from discharging their official duties and prevented President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris from accepting or holding office. So it'll be a really interesting case to watch as it continues to unfold. And I'd like to just conclude my portion of the presentation with two interesting recent case studies that really showcase the potential for civil litigation. One case involves the group Patriot Front, a white supremacist group that is committing acts of vandalism, targeting symbols of diversity, equity, and inclusion all across the country. In particular, George Floyd murals. At the bottom of the screen, you can see that they actually also vandalized a mural that was inspired by ADL's No Place for Hate programming. And they are vandalizing these murals and other statutes with Patriot Front stencils and a link to their website. In addition to, obviously, criminal remedies that might exist here, we're talking really about criminal vandalism. There are remedies available on the civil side as well. So Lawyers Committee is actually representing individuals in a case in Virginia under a civil remedy provision in Virginia's hate crime statute. And this is also a case that is raising, once again, KKK Act claims. This is a Section 1985 case. So certainly one to watch. And then another interesting case that took place or is taking place in the Northeast is a case that was filed recently by the New Hampshire Attorney General's office that is alleging a violation of the New Hampshire Civil Rights Act arising from a banner drop over a highway overpass by a group, a National Socialist Club that read "Keep New England White." So this is a really creative use of the New Hampshire Civil Rights Act that contemplates claims when rights are interfered with by individuals who unlawfully trespass on the property of another, in addition to other forms of conduct. So again, something really to keep an eye on. It's an interesting and potentially groundbreaking case using that New Hampshire civil rights statute. So zooming out, big picture, goals of litigation. Of course, accountability, deterrence are the primary goals. Often when we're thinking about civil litigation, compensation, punitive damages, injunctive relief can also be on the table. But civil litigation also really has the potential to wreak havoc on the operations and activities of some of the groups that we are most concerned about, which is significant and something to keep in mind. And also, when civil judgments are secured, they can be enforced against individuals, into the foreseeable future. So there's real potential for civil litigation to disrupt the trends that we are seeing. ADL has identified a few considerations that folks should keep top of mind when thinking about civil litigation. One challenge that we faced is fear on the part of individuals who are targeted to think about civil litigation, to think about coming forward and bringing a lawsuit against someone who has already caused such significant and severe harm. So that's certainly an issue that we are seeing all across the board when it comes to litigating against extremism. Civil litigation can be time intensive. It can, require a lot of investment in emotional energy, a lot of investment financially. And so we're trying to, as ADL, ease that burden by providing pro bono support, as well as by working with elected officials and state attorney general's offices in cases where individuals aren't necessarily comfortable being a plaintiff in a case. We also have to, as I mentioned before, be really mindful of free speech protections when we're thinking about civil litigation. And civil litigation in the cyber realm is very challenging due to constraints posed by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which really limits liability on the part of tech platforms for hate online. So with that, I'd like to pause my component of the presentation, just pause momentarily to see if there are any burning questions, but want to turn it over to my colleague from the Center on Extremism now.
Just waiting to see if there's any questions. No, I guess we can, if anyone has any questions, we can take.
I have a question.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit about the intimidation of drop boxes, voting drop boxes, and where that falls? I'm just curious the line between sort of when it's really a hate or crime that you're talking about and when it's not. So.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think all cases will really be fact specific, and it will require a fact intensive analysis to see whether perpetrators are preventing or interfering with someone's right to cast their ballot through threats, intimidation, or coercion, which generally speaking is the operative language. So those are certainly cases to watch, and very much cases that we are watching given the targeting of a key aspect of our democracy, right? The right to cast a ballot. And I think there will be really interesting cases that unfold not only under the federal KKK Act, but also under state law. So Massachusetts Civil Rights Act, for example, could be really useful in a case or fact pattern like the one that you described.
Great. I'm going